purpose of this video is to go over the four major compromises that were sort of hammered out at the Constitutional Convention. It's important that compromises could be reached because there were so many different groups that were represented there. There were free states and slave states, big states and small states, farming states, more industrialized states. So it definitely was more important that compromises could be reached. The first issue that had to be dealt with at the Constitutional Convention would be how the new Congress is set up. This is largely a battle between like the big states and the small states. The big states proposed something called the Virginia Plan. The Virginia Plan proposed that the new Congress would be bicameral, which means made up of two houses or two parts, and that both of these houses or parts would be based on how large a state's population was, meaning that the big states would have more power in the new Congress because they obviously have more people. The small states, they proposed their plan in what was called known as the New Jersey Plan. And what they called for was essentially keeping what the Articles of Confederation had a unicameral Congress, which means like one house or one part, and then every state would get one vote regardless of your population size. Because this was something that benefited them that existed under the article system, so they didn't want to fix it. Obviously, there is some sort of room to compromise in the middle. The compromise they work out is called the Great or the Connecticut Compromise because it was helped to be reached by Roger Sherman, who was from Connecticut. And ultimately, this compromise sets up the Congress that we have today, which is made up of the House of Reps. Today, that's 435 people. And to make the big states happy, this is based on population. So, like the larger the state you have, or the larger the state you are, the more population you have, the more representatives you get of the 435. So Pennsylvania has like 18 of the 435 representatives, where a small state like Wyoming only has one of the 435. So that's where the big states would be happy. To make the small states happy, they created what was called the Senate, which obviously is still in existence today, and every state gets two votes regardless of the size of your state. So Pennsylvania has two senators, Wyoming has two senators, and there's currently 100 senators today. 50 states, two senators each, that's 100. So Congress is made up of 535 people. Part of it's based on your population size. Part of it, everybody is equal. The second issue is, should slaves be counted as part of a state's population count? So population is going to determine two things under the new government. We just talked about it. How much representation each state is going to get in the House of Reps is determined by your state's population. So the question is, are we going to count slaves as part of a state's population? The second question is, there's going to be taxation in this new government, and how large a state's population would be would determine how much you're paying to the federal government in taxes. So again, are we going to count slaves as part of a state's population? So the sides fighting in this are not big states and small states, but like northern states and southern states. So the northern's position on this is they want to count slaves for taxation purposes, but not for representation purposes. And it's because the northern states don't have any slaves to count. So if you count them for taxation purposes, that means the South has to count them, and they're going to have to pay more in taxes, and that's less than the North will have to pay. But they don't want to count them for representation purposes because, again, the North doesn't have any. So that means the South is going to have like more representation than them in the new House of Representatives. The Southern position is the exact opposite, where let's count them for what will benefit us, which is representation, right? So we want to count the slaves for representation purposes because this will give us more representatives, but let's not count them for taxation purposes because we don't want to pay more in taxes. The compromise that's worked out is known as the Three-Fifths Compromise. And what is decided is that 3/5 of the southern state slave population will be counted. So you'll take up count how many slaves are in a state, and you'll take 3/5 of that number, and that's what's included in the population count. The North is happy because that means the South's going to pay a little bit more in taxes. The South's happy because that means you're going to get a little bit more representatives out of it. The big loser in this scenario, obviously, are slaves, because the social significance of this compromise is that white people count as a whole person, but African American slaves count as less than a whole person. They count as 3/5 of that person, directly contradicting the phrase in the Declaration that all men are created equal. So there's like deeper social significance to the Three-Fifths Compromise. Another major compromise that's worked out is over the issue of how much economic control should the new Congress have and what to do about slavery. So the Northern position on commerce is that they want the new government to be able to regulate economic activity between the states and between our country and like other countries. The Southern states were very hesitant to give Congress this new power. However, remember the North had abolished slavery by this point, so on a like unrelated issue, Northerners were beginning to discuss what to do about this institution of slavery in the new government, which made the Southern states a little nervous. So the Southern states obviously wanted to keep slavery, but they also feared giving the government more economic powers. So they ended up compromising these two sort of like issues. The first is to make the North happy. The national government, the new Congress would have the ability to regulate like commerce and economic activity, making the northern states happy. In exchange, the northern states promise that they won't attempt to sort of abolish the slave trade for another 20 years. So they give southern states another 20 years, which will be until 1807, to continue to bring new slaves into the country. And then after that point, slavery can still continue, but the slave trade, which many looked at as the most sort of horrible part of the institution of slavery, would no longer be allowed in the United States. So again, there's a part that makes each side happy. And then the last issue that was decided that we're going to focus on is like how the new president will be selected in our new government. The first sort of position, again, this is not big states versus small states or northern states versus southern states. It's just like two different like schools of thought. The first position on how to select the president is that the president should be appointed by like wealthy, educated individuals. It was such an important decision to make that you should have a very small number of people be responsible for that decision. There was another group that believed that all people really should have the ability to select the president to basically allow citizens to directly elect the president. And then the compromise that they come up with, which is a super complicated system that we still have today, is the Electoral College, which takes like parts of like both of these plans and blends them together. So today, the president is selected by what we refer to as the Electoral College system. So here's the deal. Citizens on election day vote. Right? So in November, citizens will go to the polls and they'll vote for one candidate or the other. You're not actually, when you're voting for a candidate, necessarily voting directly for that candidate. What you're doing is you're voting for electors that'll be sent to the state capitol several weeks later, and then they'll make the final decision for you. We'll talk about that more in a second. If you notice, each state has a numerical like value attached to it. That's the number of electors that each state has. The way you get that number is you add the number of reps that each state has in the House of Reps, plus the number of senators each state has, which is 2, and that gets you your Electoral College number. So, for example, Pennsylvania's got 20, which means we have 2 senators, we have 18 reps, you add them together, that gets you 20, right? Basically, what happens in each state on election day, whichever candidate gets the most votes from the people, their electors get to go make the decision. So in the case of Pennsylvania, the Democratic Party in Pennsylvania will select 20 electors. The Republican Party will do the exact same thing. They'll select 20 electors. If more votes go to the Republican candidate, then the 20 Republican chosen electors get to go to Harrisburg 3 weeks later to make the decision. If more people in the state vote for the Democratic candidate, then the 20 electors that were chosen by the Democrats will get to go to Harrisburg 3 weeks later and make the decision. Right? Basically, what happens is you need a number of 270 electors to win. That's the majority. And whatever candidate gets 270 electors, like you win the presidential election. So this is a compromise because the citizens are involved, but the citizens are selecting electors that are making the final decision for them.